Let's bring in Congressman Brad Knott, Republican of North Carolina. He sits on the House Judiciary Committee. What's your assessment of the way the Biden administration handled the Afghan resettlement program, Congressman?
Thank you. You know, it's interesting. The same government that designed the disastrous Afghan withdrawal in August of 2021, that's the same government that designed the resettlement program. And we've heard lots of testimony in committee. There was no vetting. This was a processing operation, and they welcomed tens of thousands of people with little to no review into the country. And it was a disaster then, and it's going to be a disaster going forward until we can get a hold on this type of operation.
You'll get no argument from West Virginia Governor Morrisey, who says the vetting process essentially didn't exist. Listen.
There's so much cleanup that has to get done. You know, I was saying yesterday that when I was Attorney General, I used to have to be regularly involved in lawsuits against the Biden border disorder. Well, now there's a lot more policy work that needs to be done to make sure that all of these millions and millions of undocumented aliens that came in and other people, that we have to review what are they doing, and are we confident that there's not another major criminal lurking?
But I recall reading, back at the time of the, chaotic Afghan withdrawal, there were U.S. military members who were saying, look, we left people behind there who were good people, who helped us out, who translated for us and risked their lives. How do you get those people out and bring in, or leave those people behind, I should say, and bring in people like these suspects?
Well, it's a great point, because when you have a sloppy bureaucratic operation like what Biden did with immigration, you harm everybody. You harm the country, you harm our allies, you harm those who help us in wartime. But I will push back in this regard. There's this assumption that the only way to help people is to bring them into the United States. And there are some people who will never assimilate into this country, whether it's because of cultural irregularities or their refusal to submit to Western values. We should not insist on bringing those people into the country. Sure, we can help them. But what Biden did is he brought in millions of people without any care, and distributed them around the country. And again, if we paused immigration in full, we would still have a monumental task ahead of us to protect the American people based off of what he did. And it's a real shame. And there are tens of thousands of people in the country right now, if not more than that, who are going to commit harms on the American people. And I applaud the president for trying to turn those errors around.
Take a look at the numbers in the Biden years. 10,850,000 people encountered at the U.S. southern border, almost 11 million. 1,900 of them were known to be on the terror watch list. And those are just the ones that Border Patrol was actually able to stop and identify. So when you figure that a number of people, a significant number of people, got past Border Patrol without even, so much as a hello, there could be real problems ahead in terms of, the people we've let into this country.
We had testimony in the Judiciary Committee that there were hundreds of miles of border that Border Patrol was ordered not to patrol. And when you think about how just absolutely derelict in duty that order was, there is really no guess, no estimate about how many threats are in the country because of the Democrats' open border policies. And again, I urge all Americans, again, be vigilant. Know that this administration is different. We want to protect this country. We want to steward this country. And we cannot let just millions of people from around the world come here without any review and assume that everything is going to work out fine. That's not the case, and we must get back on the ball in this regard.
There's an Army Special Forces veteran, Jim Hansen, who said that the suspect in this National Guard shooting in Washington, he may have worked for the CIA, but he had some peculiar qualifications. Listen.
The CIA was tasked with finding anyone they could who was willing to help us fight our enemies there. That doesn't mean that these were good people by definition. We wanted killers in the unit he was in. We don't need them here. And I think we need to understand, as President Trump said, that there are cultures and countries that do not share the values of Western civilization, and some of those people should not be coming here ever.
Echoing your point, saying that, you know, some of the folks who were in Afghanistan, yes, they might have helped U.S. forces, but they don't necessarily need to be in the United States.
That's exactly right. America is a special place, and there are billions of people around the world who will harm this country, either with intent or because their cultures, their values do not align with this country. And when that's the case, we must keep them out. That's not to say we cannot protect or help those who help us, but bringing them here and putting them in a neighborhood in the United States, that is not something that's wise on any level. And again, trying to undo the harm of the last 4 years, it's going to take a monumental and very deliberate effort for many years to come.
Congressman Brad Knott, Republican of North Carolina. It's good of you to come on. Thank you.
Thank you.
Hey, Sean Hannity here. Hey, click here to subscribe to Fox News YouTube page and catch our hottest interviews and most compelling analysis. You will not get it anywhere else.